it's safe to say we are now very much in the AI age, and we're seeing rapid adoption across businesses to enable their employees and teams to work with the data that they interact with day to day in a more human format. And a chatbot is the typical example we see. But one of the issues and areas where you really need to design and think about how you implement these systems is around authorization. A chatbot really needs to make sure that the data that the user is interacting with is the data that they are allowed to access. And this is where we've introduced a new use case for Cerbos, which is using Cerbos for adding guardrails around your RAG style architectures. So the best way to demonstrate how this works is with a demo. So we have a chatbot application here. It's like an expenses tracking system behind the scenes. Users are filing expenses. We've enabled a chat interface on top of it for users to find out what their expenses are and get summary information from it. So I'm going to go and ask a question, and I'm going to pretend to be a user called Sally. She's a user in the EMEA sales team. And I can go off and ask that particular question, list all the expenses. And we've got an answer back, which is 5 different expenses of different amounts. Now, we have business rules in place which says if you're not in the finance team, you should only see the expenses that you own, and also those expenses which have been approved and are assigned to you. And what we've essentially done with this chatbot experience by default is kind of bypassed all those rules. So let's go and look how these systems are stuck together. So typically in this kind of RAG or Retrieval-Augmented Generation application architecture, you have your underlying data sets. These are in your traditional databases, and you load that data into what's called a vector store. So the data that's in your database table goes through an embedding process, vectorized, and stored into a vector database, which is a specialized database that's very good at finding similar or related documents or vectors based on some query. And now the query in this case is actually an embedded version of a prompt. So a user asks the question, for example, what's the total of the expenses? That goes through an embedding process. Then the vector store is queried to find the related documents, and then those documents are injected into the original prompt. So now the prompt that goes off the LLM is that question, what are the expenses? But in it are all the documents that need to be computed upon. So the LLM in this case doesn't know anything about the data, but the internal business data has been kind of injected or passed into the prompt or augmented, and then that prompt goes off the LLM to come up with an answer. So what does it actually kind of look like? If we go and look at the vector store here, behind the scenes, in order to do authorization, we've loaded into the vector store our document. So the ID, a embedded or a vectorized version of it. So that data structure has been converted into a vector. And then we've also attached metadata to it. And this is really key when it comes to authorization, because this is where you can start associating attributes about the particular document that's been stored. So for example, we're storing who the owner is, what status it was, what region of the world is associated with it. And this is where you can use authorization policies to use those attributes to decide what documents should be allowed to pass back to the LLM system. Now for this example application, behind it we have Cerbos policies. So jumping over to a Cerbos playground, we have some rules around who's allowed to view expenses. And we're saying we have a derived rule that says you must be the owner of the particular expense, or you must be a manager for the region that the expense belongs to, or you must be in the finance team and a manager in the finance team to view the expenses. So those documents have been loaded into the vector store. And now we're going to add a step in our process. So when that question comes in, we ask what are the total expenses. That question then goes through an embedding model. But this time we're actually going to go over to Cerbos and say, okay, what are the conditions or what are the controls we need to put in place around what documents inside of the vector store should be allowed to be retrieved. And this is what limits what data comes back out. Because without this step in place, you're essentially giving full access to all the underlying business data to all users that interact with the chatbot, because it's not enforcing their permissions and their controls around what data gets injected and augmented into the input prompt. So that query, we use this something called a Cerbos query plan. So what's a query plan look like? Cerbos query plan allows you to basically say to Cerbos, here's this user, and this just demonstrates what it looks like, this ID, these resources, these attributes, and then Cerbos will give you back a filter, a set of conditions. So we're saying, based on our authorization policies that have been defined, the owner ID attribute of the resource must be equal to Sally. If I go and look at a different user in a different team, run that query again, this time this particular user, Derek, actually has access to it. If I go and look at Frank actually has now somewhat different condition. His owner, he must be the owner of it, so owner ID is equal to Frank, and the amount must be less than 10,000. And these are fully dynamic based on the current authorization policy. So if I now say list all the expenses, and this time I do first, if I do it as before, where I'm going to pretend the authorization policy has been put in place. I'm going to get all the expenses back. Now, if I now do this, but turn on our authorization policy filtering using this new use case with Cerbos and send that query off, what's now going to happen is it's going to first go and check Cerbos, go and get what those filters should be based on our policy, and then filter down what comes out of the vector store. So now we've gone down from those 5 expenses to just the 3 I should be able to see. If I go and look at the details, what's going on behind here, the query plan said the owner ID must be equal to Sally. That's been converted into a vector store metadata filter using ChromaDB behind the scenes. And then the prompt has been augmented with the documents that meet those criteria, and we've filtered that down. So we have some the actual documents themselves, then the rest of the prompt, and then it comes up with the actual answer. So with this capability, we've secured and locked down our prompt flow, and we've locked down our chatbot experience to be aware of the logic and the authorization rules we have inside of the business, and it leverages the existing Cerbos query plan so you can plug it into any vector store you may be using. This is just one example of the kind of authorization and design considerations you need to make when adopting AI systems to make sure it has the correct guardrails inside your application. You can find out more about this use case as well as how to go and implement inside your business today on the Cerbos website. You can also find the open source project at github.com/Cerbos. Thanks.